Social influence. You go to the group meeting completely ready to vote for option A, but after a 15-minute group discussion, you end up voting for option B. You go out with some friends to order pizza. You're a vegan. They all want pepperoni. You say, please, let's just get half and half. They say, no, we need more pepperoni. You end up having to pick the pepperoni off your pizza. You go to the store intent on buying an Android-based cell phone, but you end up with an iPhone like everyone else has. You dress in a particular way, which you believe is your own fashion and style, but actually, if you look around the room, you look like you're dressed pretty much like everyone else is dressed. You're part of a group which just makes a decision to engage in some sort of odd behavior. It could be a hazing process, it could be a philanthropy project, it could be any number of initiatives which, in hindsight, was not the best decision, and you wonder how you could go along with the rest of the group. The explanation is social influence. We are dramatically influenced by other people's behaviors. We tend to conform, although in some cases we're able to resist the group and influence the group, but majority influence is somewhat more powerful than minority influence. We've already talked about both those processes. It's now time to turn to the question of what is the source of this influence? What social, psychological, and personal factors determine when an individual will change as a result of other people's behaviors and actions? As we examine this process, I'll have to admit I am something of a nonconformist myself, because most analyses of the sources of social influence stress two basic causes. Going back to classic analyses by Hal Kelly, for example, pinpointing the difference between informational and normative influence. Deutsch and Girard's analysis, also in the 1950s, stress the importance of, in some cases, we gain information about how to act simply by observing other people. It's a strictly cognitive, non-emotional response. But in some cases, we act in ways so that we can comply with the positive expectations of others, according to Deutsch and Girard. And even more recent analyses, for example, Bob Cialdini's analysis on his norm focus theory, stresses the important distinction between informational sources of change and normative sources of change. And I'm not going to disagree with that. In many cases, people change as a result of acquiring the information based on observing other people's responses, versus in some cases they change because they wish to comply with the norms of the situation. But I do want to add two additional sources of influence as well, and these are implicit sources of influence and interpersonal sources of influence. And that's because if, say, for example, you look at the film 12 Angry Men and you watch the individuals responding to the influence of others, in some cases it's 11 people voting provides information about what the most accurate, best verdict might be. The norms of the situation suggest that if we should go along with the majority. In a Western country, which is based on democracy, majority rules is the implicit decision rule in most groups. So the norms suggest we do that. And simply the norms of being cooperative, being a reasonable person. If everyone else agrees with this, why make waves? Let's go along with others. That's completely normative. But in some cases, influence is a result of more implicit processes, just simply the tendency to do what other people do. The phrase monkey see, monkey do. The mimicry that we tend to see in people's behavior. It's not a cognitive process. We're not wondering how should we act in this situation and gaining information by looking at how most people act. We're simply mimicking their behavior in a non-thoughtful way. Also in the 12 Angry Men play, in some cases, it's not implicit, it's not information, it's not. They get in each other's faces. They are angry men. They try to influence each other in dramatic ways. They try to use force to influence others. And I don't think this forceful form of influence, shouting at an individual, for example, threatening coercion against another individual, I don't think those forms of social influence are captured by either the concept of informational influence or normative influence. And so I add interpersonal influence to represent these stronger, more direct forms of social influence, which still are emanating from other members of the group. Let me go through quickly these four sources of influence if I can. Implicit influence. Recent research has shown that human beings tend to mimic each other. If you look at a group of people standing in a circle waiting for a movie to begin, and one individual crosses his or her arms, pretty quickly, within 30 seconds, several other people in the group will cross their arms as well. It's not because we think arm crossing is a good thing to do in this ambiguous situation. It's because we tend to mimic other people's actions without realizing we're doing that. Probably Ellen Langer's classic study of mindlessness is a good example of this form of implicit influence. She approached individuals waiting in line to use a photocopy machine and asked them one of three things. In the control condition, she just said, "Can I get in front of you and make copies?" In another condition, she asked, "Excuse me, I'm in a rush. Can I get in front of you and make my copies?" But in the third condition, the request was, "May I get in front of you? I need to make copies." And as she points out, of course you need to make copies. It's a photocopy machine. Saying "I need to make copies" provides no information whatsoever. And yet you see the results are that people are much more compliant when in the rush condition says "I'm in a rush," which is a legitimate excuse, although you could deny it. But when they said "I need to make copies," that was also influential in changing people's behavior, although it provided no information whatsoever. Dr. Langer suggests that the reason this was influential, the reason people responded to it, was because they were relatively mindless. People expected some sort of excuse to be given, they heard an excuse given, and so they were compliant. I should point out that if you had to make an awful lot of copies, there was very little compliance with your request. Saying "Can I get in front of you? I have to make 20 copies," shocked people out of their basic mindlessness. So in this particular study, the idea was that people were responding to the implicit influence processes. Moving right along, informational influence processes. We do glean information about the best way to respond by watching to see how other people respond. Social comparison theory is based on this fundamental principle of comparison. If you're in a restaurant and you don't know which fork to use to eat your salad, look around and see what other people are doing, and if they're using that little fork next to the big fork, then perhaps that's the best fork you should use in this particular context. In many cases, we face situations which are ambiguous, unclear, we're not really sure what to do, so we look to the actions of others as guides for how to respond. And that would be described as informational influence. If you're in a jury and you're not sure if the person's guilty or innocent, and you look around the room on the first vote, and 10 of the people have voted guilty, well, there's information to be gained. 10 independent individuals have felt the defendant was guilty. That's pretty good evidence that perhaps the defendant is guilty. There is a tendency to misjudge, in fact, however, what other people think. There is a false consensus and tendency to think that other people think like we do. And also to misjudge what the actual norms are in a particular situation. We have a difficult time calibrating accurately how other people are responding, so we often assume that our response is a good indication of how other people respond. So we assume unjustifiably that there is a consensus when there in fact is not. Dual process theories of informational influence, these are prominent in theories of persuasion as well as social influence, suggest that we base our choices on direct information that's available by watching other people, but sometimes also we assume that other people's responses provides heuristic information that we can respond to. So this informational influence involves both direct information processing and indirect forms of information processing. Normative influence, of course, is rooted in the concept of a norm, which is unfortunately a very complicated concept. At one level, people comply with norms because they know they will be negatively sanctioned if they break the norms. But do not forget that norms are often internalized standards. We don't simply follow norms because we're fearful of punishment or we're hoping to please others. we ourselves accept these norms as our own when we've internalized them. So we're not merely complying or conforming with others' expectations. We're following our own individual preferences when we're engaged in normative influence. Research looking at the relationship between normative influence and a classic theory in social psychology, cognitive dissonance, does suggest that that unpleasant feeling which is triggered by holding simultaneously two inconsistent cognitions, cognitive dissonance, is very similar to the feeling we get when we believe one thing but the rest of our group member believes something else. So it's been tied back to the normative influence process, that the individual in 12 Angry Men who sees 11 others disagreeing him experienced an unpleasant psychological state which he was motivated to reduce. Two ways to reduce it: convince all the others that they're wrong, or comply with their judgments and go along with what the majority has decided. Interpersonal influence, we've already done implicit, informational, normative. Interpersonal influence is a stronger, more direct form of influence. I'll define it as verbal and nonverbal tactics, pressure, designed to influence change. And this form of influence was demonstrated well by Stanley Schachter in his 1956 study of reactions to deviance. This is not an actual picture from his research, but from a reenactment that Dr. Schachter conducted afterwards, featuring, in fact, a graduate student who went on to become a social psychologist himself, Dr. Bibb Latané, there, in the role of the deviant. But what Schachter did is he created groups of individuals, in many cases 7 individuals. He put particular deviants within the group. 4 of the group members were natural group members, but he would put 3 different kinds of confederates in the group. One individual described as the deviant, who never went along with the group's decisions, a slider who began disagreeing with the group but then eventually changed his mind, and then one individual who was a conformist throughout. Schachter investigated a number of variables, but he was interested in communication, which for us represents the degree to which the group was pressuring through communication the minority member to change, and he tracked that level of communication over time. And the individual who held the modal position, you saw a slight increase over time in communication, but not much change from the beginning to the end, because after all, the mode agreed with the majority. You found a different pattern with the slider. You found that the group increased frequently with the slider at the beginning, but when the slider changed his opinion, you've actually found communication with the slider decreased over time. First, what's perhaps most interesting is the deviant. Over time, the group members increased dramatically their level of communication with the deviant until time ran out. They were never able to change the group's, the minority members' position, but they remained forceful in their communication with the individual. In rare cases, when the group was highly cohesive and discussing a topic which was quite relevant to the group, you found a fourth tendency, which was to exclude the deviant from the group. In this case, the group communicated at a high rate with the deviant, but in some groups they reached a point, a threshold, where they decided we can't change this individual's opinion. In fact, we don't want this person in the group, and so they stopped communicating with that individual. This was a relatively rare effect. It occurred just with cohesive groups, and groups which were discussing a topic which was quite relevant to the group's formed purposes. Later, Schachter asked who should continue within the group, and certainly what you found was the excluded deviant was the person who was rejected by the group the most. But actually any deviant was rejected if the group had to shrink down in size from 7 to 6, and you were asked to nominate one individual to remove from the group, it was generally a deviant. If you were asked to indicate who should be given one of the more distasteful roles within the group, such as the secretary, recorder for the group, generally that was given to the deviant. One interesting effect was the slider, who disagreed initially with the group but eventually conformed to the group's decision. He was also slightly less liked than the mode. The most liked individual in the group was that individual who always agreed with the group. So communication with this deviate eventually diminished, at least when cohesive was working on relevant tasks. I mention that because Schechter, to be accurate, did not find this evidence of exclusion in most of the groups. It was only under these rare conditions where it was a cohesive group working on a highly relevant task. But any dissent from the group reduced an individual's likability overall. Recently, there have been a number of theoretical developments which have extended the exploration of the sources of interpersonal influence. Those theories are, for example, normative focus theory by Bob Cialdini. He's talked about the idea that normative influence tends to be stronger than informational influence. He investigates this with his fascinating studies looking at, for example, who will litter and who will not. In one particular investigation, he tried to make norms salient about littering. And he does find that if you make the actual norm about salience relevant, instead of just the information about how many people respond in a given situation salient, which would be informational influence, he finds that the normative influence is a stronger influence on behavior than informational influence. Subjective group dynamics is a theoretical perspective which argues that all of us have an intuitive conception of group-level processes. That line of research has generated studies of the black sheep effect, which does find that in some cases a member of the in-group will receive a harsher treatment than the member of an out-group, who engage both when the in-group and out-group member engage in the same sort of behavior. So the black sheep effect is that an individual will be evaluated more negatively when that individual who is not a group member performs than an individual who is not the member who performs the same sort of action. So if, for example, an individual does something that you don't like very much, but they're not in your group, you won't respond as harshly as you would to an individual who was a member of your group. Another recent extension is normative conflict model, which makes the very interesting point that in many cases it's group members who most identify with their group, who are most committed to their group, who are dedicated to their group. Those are the individuals who are most willing to experience this kind of interpersonal rejection from the group so that they can protect their group from making a bad decision, basically. So that nonconformity, counterconformity is sometimes a sign actually of increased commitment to a group rather than a separation from the group, if you will. One applied topic that is related to the sources of social influence involves bystander apathy. Why in some cases group members don't respond to emergencies as they should. This research was instigated in part by the tragedy of the Kitty Genovese incident, in which a young woman was attacked as she came home late at night, and many people overheard the attack, and yet they did not respond. Although the research investigating this incident suggests it's not clear how many people actually heard the attack, and in fact the incident has been described in so many different ways it's practically reached the level of a parable in discussing the basic capacity for human beings to fail to meet their moral obligations. But in any case, it did trigger social psychological studies of why a group of individuals would not respond, and the basic finding does support the bystander effect. People help less when in groups than when they are alone. Much of this research was done by Latney and Darley initially, where they investigated the group inhibition of bystander intervention in emergencies. And as we've just talked about the sources of influence, all of them are relevant in this case. But again, the focus typically is on informational influence as well as normative influence. When people confront an emergency situation, they're not sure if it's an emergency. They look around to see how other people are responding, and they make the mistake of thinking other people's non-response signals that it is not an emergency. And so they do not respond, but their non-response then is taken taken as evidence by others that there's no emergency. So it causes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy where no one responds even though a response is needed. Normative influence is the idea that in some cases it's best to allow people to solve their problems on their own. Sometimes it's embarrassing to intervene in a situation if a person doesn't want to have help. We've probably all had the case where an individual has dropped something or fallen down and they're not actually seriously injured, they're more embarrassed than anything else, and going to their aid will increase their embarrassment. And there is some research that helping tends to be more normative in some cultures than others. For example, in Iberian cultures, Latin American cultures, Spanish cultures, the norm of simpatico, to take care of others, even others you do not know well, strangers in fact, visitors to your country, that's much stronger in these countries than it is in other countries such as America. So when cross-cultural researchers have feigned accidents, minor accidents in various cultures, they do find that helping is more likely in certain countries where the norm of simpatico exists than others. The final explanation for why group members don't respond is diffusion and responsive, as mentioned in their classic analysis, that individuals do feel as though they're not as responsible for intervening and helping when there's a group of other people present. So diffusion of responsibility, as Latin Darley originally said, seems to be the most likely explanation for this result. If an individual is alone when he notices an emergency, he is solely responsible for coping with it. If he believes others are also present, he may feel that his own responsibility for taking action is lessened, making him less likely. All these causes combine to create a bystander effect, so that people facing an emergency do not respond as they should. The takeaway message, of course, for us is to not make that mistake, to not fall prey to the bystander effect. That if you see an individual in need, you should not look to the non-responses of others nearby or feel as though it's not your responsibility to intervene, but to move past these social psychological processes and render aid, since it's best to err on the side of providing help when none is needed than to not provide help when help is actually needed. Thank you, as always, for joining me.